In this county in the countryside, in this rural area, there's still no broadband, and people have to use dial-up internet, spending about $200 a month. It was quite shocking to me.
When I was a kid celebrating the New Year back home, there was gambling, and I wasn't into it. Some adults would coax me, saying, I'll give you money. If you win, it's yours. If you lose, it's mine. It was all about encouraging someone to step into another risky area. How did you get through last year? I got through last year because my husband started working for a shoe company here in Switzerland.
Then he asked me, hey, are you interested in moving to Switzerland? At that time, I had actually interned in Switzerland during my undergraduate studies, so I thought, when more did the chance to move there, it would be nice to experience life there. But I hadn't seriously considered it after that. Later, my husband said we can move to Switzerland, and I thought, that sounds great, I agree. To come, your job allows for it, right? At first, I hadn't thought it through because I was doing impact investing in Boston. When we were in the US, I was able to work remotely. But at that time, I wasn't sure if I should continue working remotely for my original company. I was wondering whether I should quit or what to do. At that time, I was also working as a side gig as a career coach, and I was a bit torn about whether to quit and go full-time as a career coach or what. In the end, I just moved here without a clear plan. After moving, I spent a few months doing both my original impact investing job and working as a career coach. As I kept working, I gradually felt that I could turn my career coaching into a full-time job. So, I wrapped things up with my company in the US and became a full-time coach. I've heard a lot about career coaching, but I feel like I hear very little about impact investing. Could you explain a bit about it? Sure, no problem. Impact investing is actually a way of using investment methods to address social and environmental issues. There are many different strategies under various impact funds. For example, I used to talk about impact investing back home, and then I did it in the US too. The strategies of the funds in my home country and those in the US are really different. For instance, in my home country's fund, we invested in small social enterprises that provide services to vulnerable groups. There was a project focused on an art therapy school for children with autism. In the US, the company I joined later had a completely different strategy. We invested in more established small and medium-sized enterprises in impoverished counties in the U.S., aiming to create jobs. This kind of investment focuses a lot on small and medium-sized enterprises that are owned by minorities and those that provide jobs for minority communities.
I'm wondering if the ESG investing we often hear about is a type of impact investing. Impact investing has a meaning where E stands for environment and S is for social, right?
Right, and governance should fall under the broader category of impact investing, correct? Yes, exactly. Different organizations have varying interpretations of the logical relationship between impact investing and ESG investing. Some organizations say that ESG and impact investing are parallel concepts. Some say that ESG and impact investing have a hierarchical relationship, where impact investing is a larger umbrella. It really depends on how you define it, but these two are definitely closely related, like siblings.
Okay, got it. Just like the Jiangsu 13 Taibao, right? Yes, exactly. Can you share a bit about your work experience in the US? Many people might not be very familiar with these small towns or particularly small counties. In America,
even people in the US might not fully grasp just how extremely poor poverty can indeed be. At that time, I was involved in a lot of projects, one of which was in Baltimore. We worked with the local Baltimore Economic Development Corporation on a fund for the city. When I got there, my local colleague said, if it's around 6 hours, 67 minutes p.m. and you get back to the hotel, you shouldn't go out. It's dangerous for Asian women to be out at that time. Don't go for a walk by yourself from the hotel when we're not around.
Yes. And also, this is about the poverty rate we are investing in.
it means that 30% of the population is below the income level of impoverished counties in the U.S. So it is a very challenging urban project. At the same time, we will also undertake some rural projects, such as infrastructure projects in the American countryside. At that time, I was quite shocked because in China, we have already connected broadband to every village, but in the U.S., it is not the case yet. For example, in some counties in Colorado, there is no broadband in those small counties. You might wonder, how can there be no broadband in a capitalist society? But it's because those rural areas have such low population density. For instance, when AT&T or Verizon come to provide broadband, they just don't make a profit. If they don't make a profit, they won't lay the lines, right? So in this rural county, there is still no broadband, and everyone has to use, dial-up internet. And yes, there will be such situations, or if you compare broadband, with dial-up internet, you might spend, $200 a month, something like that. Yes. So I was quite shocked at that time. Could you elaborate a bit more? At that time, with the Baltimore government, they were also working together on a fund. What were they doing, and what were the goals? Yes, they mainly approached us because of their situation regarding job creation, local employment. They hoped to introduce some private funds. They could invest in some local businesses and provide employment opportunities for minorities. The main collaboration model they were looking for with us was actually PPP, which stands for Public-Private Partnership. The local government's development agency contributes, for example, 20% of the funds, and we, as private investors, match 4 times that amount, meaning we provide 80% of the fund. For instance, if we set up a fund of 10 million, they contribute 20%, which is 2 million, and we contribute 8 million. Then from the perspective of the local government's economic development agency, they can leverage their 2 million to accomplish 10 million worth of projects, right? To put it simply, the local government's funding is also limited. The benefit for us is that after we set up this project and fund, the local government provides endorsement, which helps us find projects. Additionally, the local government's fund acts as a sort of insurance for our private fund. For example, when we generate returns from our projects, we first distribute those returns to our private investors. Then the remaining funds are eventually returned to the government, so essentially the government bears a greater risk and acts as a sort of risk guarantor, meaning if there are losses, they are shared. Yes, exactly. But this transaction means that in exchange, they can use 2 million to do something worth 10 million, right? Okay.
If I were gambling during the new year back home, and I don't like to gamble, some adults would encourage me, saying, I'll give you money. If you win, it's yours, and if you lose, it's mine.
Oh, I see. It's all about encouraging someone to enter another area of risk. Yes, that's the idea. For example, when you play mahjong, right? If there are 3 players short one, they really want you to join in. Without you, they can't even play mahjong. And at that moment, the adult would say, I'll give you 10 yen. If you lose, it counts as mine. It's analogous to this. Without you, they can't play the game. Right. At that time, there were all kinds of projects. For example, I invested in a commercial laundry business. The company provides laundry services for hospitals, such as washing patient gowns and bed linens. Then, I also invested in a customer service center, right? An outsourced customer service center in Baltimore. Yes, I also invested in real estate because we are part of something called an Opportunity Zone Fund. Funding and such projects, due to U.S. policies, actually make it particularly easy to invest in real estate. So we also invested in this, specifically in the real estate of Baltimore, which is in a poverty-stricken county.
Where are you from? You just mentioned real estate. I'm a bit familiar with it, but I can't quite recall.
No, actually I'm from Beijing, and I don't know where this accent comes from.
As soon as the word opportunity zone is mentioned, I guess many listeners' radars will be alerted because they are particularly familiar with real estate, which is a type of tax policy. Moreover, Trump, as one of his few political legacies, implemented a large-scale tax cut policy, stating that if you invest and develop in our poor and underdeveloped areas, you will receive tax deductions.
Yes, that's right. So, what role do you play in this? Well, I really do everything. Today, as a lifeguard, I handle the entire investment process.
doing everything from finding projects, right? Now it's about various deal sourcing, finding project channels, and then conducting due diligence on the projects. After passing due diligence, for example, we need internal approval before proceeding. In terms of the project's aspects, it's about negotiating various funding conditions and so on. After the money is invested, it's about post-investment management because we pay a lot of attention to the impact the project has. So after the investment, for example, regarding employment, we want to know if it actually creates jobs. Are these good jobs or are they just minimum wage jobs? That's a bit concerning. Well, it's different from our initial vision. For example, tracking these outcomes after the investment is also necessary. Okay, how did this opportunity come about? Well, this was actually at a time when we were collaborating with the government, which was a particularly good situation. One point is that the government has local connections. So at that time, we collaborated with a local foundation. They heard that we were doing this and mentioned that they had a founder who is an African American. So, he is doing this, and it just happens that we want to support minorities. He said, well, he has been in this call center customer service field for a long time, and they now have a project. Would you like to consider it? Then, at that time, because of the foundation's recommendation, we got to know this founder. Okay, how do you conduct background checks? Because I haven't done these things before. We have to do the usual due diligence that isn't specific to impact investors. For example, analyzing the company's business model, right? And then, for instance, looking at their cash flow and so on. Yes, based on the fact that we have two funds, one is a bond fund and the other is an equity fund, the aspects we look at for debt and equity are different. Right now, we are making a debt investment, so we need to focus more on cash flow. In simple terms, cash flow means whether there is enough cash to repay our debt. This is actually a point of criticism for many call centers, as they are often associated with low-income jobs. So, what's the difference between that and working at McDonald's? Why is that? Where is it, right? This was a major concern for us at that time. So, yes, in terms of social aspects, it is called MBE, which means we are a minority that constitutes the majority in the board of directors and among the executives. Is there a majority of minorities, etc.? These are questions regarding, for example, high-quality employment. Will it be, for instance...
I don't know what the average was in Baltimore at that time. What percentage the company had to reach. For example, over 30% to be considered. We will look at several points, one of which is the comparison of this income to the minimum wage.
How much higher it is from multiple dimensions. One is how much higher. The second point is that many of the employees at this call center are women. For example, many women have children. So what do you think the company provides for these women and their children in terms of additional support, such as childcare centers or something like that? And for example, whether they provide health care, whether they offer medical insurance, and so on. This is a model that can easily appear in call centers, right? So after looking at all these points, it becomes clear whether they know if this employment is high-quality employment. Okay, you just mentioned squeezing out. What does that mean? Many call center businesses are criticized for saying, I'll just pay you minimum wage. And then you come here and work for about 3 months. It feels a bit like working at McDonald's, right? Then, after you leave, I'll just replace you with another batch. But actually, this is a bad business model. This kind of model is just one. You have to compete. Whoever offers the lowest wage actually has no training. Training is needed. But it's just the minimum training, like, for example, after a month of training, you work for 3 months, and then you burn out and leave. In our view, this is not a good long-term business model. Because in the long run, your training and other costs still require money. Moreover, when you go to offer, you are just competing on price. In such a situation, if others are doing the same, everyone ends up raising to the bottom, and everyone is providing this kind of commodity service.
Then everyone earns the least amount of money possible. And for these employees, it's even worse. You mentioned that he approached you as a debt fund. I'm curious about how long the debt he seeks to borrow is and what kind of return you can offer. Because he approached you for a loan, it must be cheaper than going to a bank. Right? That's my guess. Or it could be that big banks like Bank of America won't lend to him, and only you are willing to lend, which is also possible.
Yes, that's right. Many businesses come to us for loans find it very difficult to borrow from commercial banks. For example, In the case of a call center business, they don't have much collateral. Their cash flow is their only guarantee. And their cash flow is often unstable because it's not a very large business. It's not one with a stable cash flow. For example, clients might pay a large sum every 3 months, but in between, there can be various situations causing cash flow instability. So, some large banks, like Bank of America, are unwilling to take on such small clients. Yes, and the risks are relatively high. However, we are willing to take on that risk. Moreover, we also offer them interest rates that are slightly lower than those of commercial banks. The interest on this loan is also more flexible. Terms of repayment. For example, when we provide funding, we look at many of your covenants and related data. The covenant requirements, for instance, may be very high for Bank of America, while our requirements are more lenient.
Okay, probably can cut coffee.
For example, your debt-to-equity financial ratio is your debt divided by your equity, such as... right? Well, we require that your debt can be a bit higher compared to your existing equity. However, the requirements of regular commercial banks are very strict. Okay, are you worried about insolvency? Yes, that's right. Have you observed these, not just Cosine, but other similar ones? I believe you have encountered many during your investigation.
The owners of small businesses in poor areas of the U.S. Are typically locals. What kind of specific characteristics or qualities do they have?
First of all, I think many of these small and medium-sized business owners are really very resilient. You see, doing this business is really difficult for them. And the reason that area is poor is that no one invests there, right? For example, take our call center business. Actually, I think this owner has already done a great job in areas like employee training and benefits. However, compared to other call center businesses, he still faces a high turnover rate among employees. So employees leave after working for about 6 months to a year, which actually has a significant impact on the company. I think of another project of mine, which is in Cleveland, run by a Black business owner. His business involves providing services to small to medium-sized government projects for road construction and asphalt paving. And in this situation, when they need workers, they can't find anyone. For example, some workers might only stay for 2 or 3 weeks before leaving, but they are needed when the work arises. For example, they just quit and don't want to work anymore, feeling that the job is too tough. Yes, they feel it's too hard. Every day in Cleveland, working outside paving roads is very tiring. And then they quit. This kind of issue is quite common. What is the work intensity like? It's the kind where they have to work 7 days a week, every day. Yes, what kind of work intensity are we talking about? In our call center business, the work intensity is actually quite normal. It's just one shift. For you, it's about 6 to 8 hours, and in our road paving projects, it can be quite tough, especially in road construction. In the Midwest, due to migration reasons, they can only pave roads for half the year, so from April to November, it gets particularly busy. For example, they might work 10 to 12 hours a day. Such situations do occur. So sometimes it really is quite hard.
Okay, I'm working every day, about 10 to 12 hours a day, right? Basically, you have to work every day, right?
It's just that on Saturdays and Sundays, there are Saturdays and Sundays, right? Okay, right. But to sum it up, the turnover rate is particularly high. Yes, many of these small and medium-sized enterprises just can't retain people. Yes, and then there's the demand for funding, which can sometimes be really difficult because these places just aren't profitable, right? It's like, even though we have funds like ours, in many cases, it's still about attracting some investors. And sometimes it's really hard to grow this fund. And it's also because many of these projects have owners who are minorities. So sometimes, to put it bluntly, they don't really know how to navigate the world of investors, right? how to package themselves and tell their stories, and so on. In many cases, small and medium-sized enterprises just don't know. They don't know how to package themselves, and many of these investment funds are still mostly under the control of white individuals. So sometimes attracting these investors and securing funding for expansion is quite difficult for many of these small and medium-sized enterprises.
Okay. Since they have a business and they started the company from small to large, I thought they already had some abilities and qualities. But you say they still find it very difficult to present themselves.
Because in many cases, these small and medium-sized enterprises grow mainly through their own cash flow, not by borrowing money or anything like that. For example, the laundry company we just mentioned has been operating since the 1940s. Right. During this process, most of the time they still need their own financial cash flow in their operations, but occasionally they can borrow some additional money or resources from external sources. However, during this process, it can still be quite difficult to seek out necessary financing and support, as you mentioned earlier. For example, the call center project you participated in, it ultimately created...
How many jobs can it approximately create?
Yes. There are actually quite a few jobs created by this project. For example, it created about 200 to 300 jobs in Baltimore. Okay. So one of the particularly good things it did is that many large companies in the U.S., especially since DEI became particularly popular after 2020. So many large companies need to include more minority suppliers among their suppliers in order to effectively and successfully operate. Therefore, our company just happened to strategically ride this wave in the market as a result. For example, many large companies like Google need to specifically look for these minority-owned companies. But actually, there aren't many companies that do this well. So, those minority companies that perform relatively well will have many new customer resources in this situation.
Okay. Can you talk a bit about it? You just mentioned a lot about the invested companies. Let's talk about yourselves. As a company that specializes in impact investing, where does your funding come from? Is it all from those? Because often many large companies, we see them saying what they are doing for social impact, that we are involved in this and that. I guess some of them are doing it directly, while some are doing it indirectly through companies like yours. So I'm just curious about that.
Is your funding mainly coming from large enterprises like Google and such? The main type of investors is money from large companies, which is one part. For example, some large companies may want to do some local revitalization projects in the cities they are located in. So they will allocate a portion of their own funds to invest in impact investment funds like ours. You see this kind. Then there is another type, which is high net worth individuals. This goes back to what was just mentioned. Opportunity zone. This policy for high net worth individuals, they can benefit from capital gains tax. If they invest their money into our Opportunity Zone Fund, they will have many advantages regarding capital gains tax. It can. The details are that there are many benefits in this regard. First, there are 2 rounds of benefits regarding capital gains tax. One benefit is, for example, let's say you, Xiao Shuai, as a high net worth individual. You sold, for instance, Amazon stock, right? Then you have to pay capital gains tax on the profits from that stock, right?
If I want to sell, I will sell that big ball in the city center.
Right. So when you sell this asset, you have to pay a wave of taxes. Then, when you sell the asset and take the money you earned from the sale, if you invest it in our Opportunity Zone Fund, the taxes on the asset when you sell it will be discounted for you. This is the benefit number 1. Then the second benefit is, for example, if you sell and make a profit of $100 and you invest that into our fund, if that $100 grows to $300 in 10 years, then you have made a profit of 200% on your initial profit. So, the $200 in profit does not incur capital gains tax when you withdraw it. Therefore, it means you have the benefits of capital gains tax exemption in 2 rounds, and this is mandatory for more than 10 years.
Yes, our holding period is 10 years. Okay, but the Opportunity Zone, I remember it also requires 10 years, right?
Yes, that's right. Okay, that's why many people say you continue to talk. Okay, some high net worth individuals, so for high net worth individuals, part of their motivation to invest in our fund is the tax benefits. And another part is that some high net worth individuals have their own foundations and they also want to do some socially impactful things. Ah, right. So this is the second common type of investor. Then the third type is the investors who work with local governments and foundations who provide us with guaranteed investments. So what I just mentioned is that he contributes 20% of the funds and we do 5 times the work, but he provides us with guarantees. So these 3 types are the most common. It's easy to understand why the government does this because, for example, if they just created 200 to 300 jobs,
At least it has an impact on the reputation of its officials, right? The government's reputation improves. And local security may also improve because if people have jobs, security could get better, as there would be fewer offenders. Yes. And if these job opportunities are high-paying, there could also be tax revenue. Let's talk about opportunity zones, as I have done some research on it before. It's because I remember someone told me about it before. I only knew about this matter, but I didn't realize it was a very new thing. Yes, it was something that Trump implemented during his 4 years. However, it has been met with mixed reviews because his intention was good, which was to revitalize impoverished areas in city centers and rural areas, and to attract all investments. To bring investments there, and then allow that area to have jobs, security, and tax revenue. Yes, but as mentioned earlier, many people say it has become a tax avoidance tool for the wealthy, a very effective tax avoidance tool, right? Right. Regarding this opportunity zone, what do you think? Or have you noticed how they are gaming the system?
Yes, I really feel that for me, it's quite, I feel a bit stuck. In fact, this is a big part of the reason why I eventually left my job. I felt a bit of a disconnect between what I knew and what was happening. For example, the original intention of its design is very good. But when it comes to actual execution, it turns out that based on this, the requirements of the Opportunity Zone policy are that first, you need to meet the criteria for qualifying projects. It turns out that the easiest thing to do is real estate. Yes, because for example, it requires you to ensure that the local asset appreciation must increase by a certain amount. Many of these requirements are difficult to meet if you don't have a significant physical asset. For example, in our call center business, we just can't make it into an Opportunity Zone project, mainly because of the people. Yes, it's about people. They don't have much water. For example, the project we just mentioned about paving asphalt, it also can't be done. Why? Because the Opportunity Zone has a requirement that your project must be physically located in this area. But our paving project, for instance, is being done in 10 different counties. So, it doesn't qualify as an Opportunity Zone project at all. Therefore, it leads to the conclusion that, if you want to find projects that meet the Opportunity Zone requirements, real estate is the easiest. Thus, this Opportunity Zone policy has turned into a situation where real estate companies are the ones doing the projects, which completely benefits the majority of the wealthy. They have taken advantage of it. Moreover, in real estate, if you are doing, for example, affordable housing, it actually helps solve many social issues locally. However, in many cases, it has turned into us actually building a very luxurious condo in an Opportunity Zone.
That's fine, but you still have to sell it.
Another issue arises. The classification of Opportunity Zones can sometimes be very unreasonable in certain cases, and sometimes even perplexing. For instance, take a look at a project in the bustling area of downtown Brooklyn, which is known for its vibrant atmosphere and a variety of dining options. You might feel that this area is already quite good, surrounded by places like Sweet Greens and various coffee shops that serve lattes. But this is still considered an Opportunity Zone, so there are many such situations where you feel that this place is not impoverished, yet somehow it qualifies as an Opportunity Zone. So, this is also where the local government faces many problems when designating these areas. For example, when the governor decides which areas are Opportunity Zones, many such issues arise. So in many cases, these high-end apartment buildings are built in places that, although they are designated as such, you can tell that this area is quite affluent.
So our fund has also undertaken such projects. Therefore, I feel quite conflicted when I personally work on these projects. It feels quite different from my original intention for doing this. For example, I won't specify the exact location, but it was in one of our opportunity zones. At that time, I participated in a project to develop a high-end apartment building, which was a rental project, not for sale. However, the rent was also very high, setting a new record in the city. It was the highest price locally, even though it was in an opportunity zone. Why? Because the project is next to an affordable housing development. It's an affordable housing project, and this area used to be relatively underdeveloped. However, due to the gentrification of the city, our new project is right on the border with this affordable housing project, while the other side has already become a very nice and desirable community. So at that time, I actually felt very conflicted because I felt that our project further encroached on the places where low-income people could live. It's like we bought the land of the affordable housing at a very low price and then developed it into the highest end rental property in the area. The people who originally lived here can no longer stay and have to move further out, right? So isn't this a typical criticism of the gentrification issue? Yes. So at that time it was like So I worked on this project, and at that time I felt my conscience was being condemned. Yes. And I felt that most of my time was spent negotiating with our developer because we are equity investors. We would negotiate saying, can I increase my return by 0.05 here? I would adjust my model, trying to find ways to make the numbers bigger. So in the end, I was trying to increase my return by 0.05% or something like that. I felt that most of my time was spent on this, rather than thinking about how to address the fact that we were encroaching on the places where people originally living in affordable housing used to stay. I spent very little time thinking about how to settle them or how to create local job opportunities. So I feel that in many of these opportunity zone projects, there are these problems. I feel like I've transformed from a champion of justice into a tool for the wealthy. Yes, I find it quite complex. Although this policy was initially designed to address local poverty issues, most of the requirements focus on the investment in the project, as mentioned earlier, but it doesn't really address the actual impact it has on the local community. So, how do you measure that impact? There are actually no requirements in this regard. For example, our impact reports are something we do voluntarily. However, the policy does not require this aspect, such as how many jobs are created and whether the income from those jobs is above the low-income threshold. From a policy perspective, it doesn't demand this. So I feel that from a mechanistic standpoint, we, investors, of course, are more concerned about returns. So I feel that this somewhat defeats the original purpose of designing this policy. It's not just about having money and capability. You also need to have some moral qualities. It's not our original company's fault because I think under this mechanism, we also have to respond to our investors. For example, these investors want to achieve returns that are on par with other private equity funds. So we have to extract these returns like 1.1 points from each project, one project at a time.
That being said, this is quite interesting. This is a case of how the US government works. At the federal level, it provides legal support, including from the White House and both houses of Congress, but it lacks very detailed regulations. To implement this, the federal government can't just say that Fulton County in Georgia is an opportunity zone, or that certain neighborhoods in Fulton County are opportunity zones. So how is this determined? It's up to the locals, right? But when locals make that decision, it creates a real dilemma. If they choose the areas that truly need help, those areas might be really hard to develop. So even if they have the designation, in reality, no one might want to invest there. So you have to consider some other factors. To attract investors, sometimes they end up choosing areas that seem relatively good and have investment value. I find this situation very interesting, but the federal government has no oversight in this area. I'm thinking it's like they just set up a stage. Once you're up there singing, they don't care how well you perform, right?
Yes, that's right. The local designations are all decided by the local government, so the federal government doesn't really have an official check and balance in place, and we can't be too extreme about it because, for example, many people are currently criticizing opportunity zones. Local pressure exists, and the government feels it. Why is Brooklyn, a great downtown, an opportunity zone? Federally, no oversight exists. It reminds me of home, where poor counties resist losing poor status. They get subsidies, and losing status means losing them. Is that the main reason you left? You went on to become a coach, right? I think that's a big part of it because I feel like I spent most of my time and energy on that 0.05% return related to coaching, while we also work on impactful projects. But I end up spending most of my time on impact reports. From my personal perspective on storytelling, most of the time I'm thinking about how to collaborate with these invested companies, like in our post-investment management, and how to work together to improve their operations, so they can truly achieve the impact they want to create. However, I find that I spend most of my time on how to tell the story, rather than on how to improve their operations. I feel what I do isn't me, though it was my intention to enter this industry. In terms of the strategy of this fund, I feel it doesn't align with my values. But I still find it very interesting to address poverty through business approaches. However, I think in the future, if I were to enter such a field, I might consider doing something, for example, something more successful. On one hand, organizations like that, for example, a foundation or an impact investing fund, but they don't want to focus on market returns. Right, I think that's a core issue, this market return aspect. Compared to other private equity funds that manage to do well with impact, it's really tough. I feel that if I had to choose between commercial returns and impact, I'd prefer to join an organization that prioritizes impact, some financial returns, and then really doing some impactful afternoon organizations. I think in the future, I might consider such organizations more. I remember Buffett was asked about these investment matters.
He said at the time, when you invest, you make money. The primary and only duty is to earn, so earn as much as you can. After that, you can decide how to contribute to society based on your conscience. That's a redistribution process. At that time, he had a very negative attitude towards ESG personally, yet he donated a lot of money. I also went through a similar process. When I first started impact investing, I thought, I want to do both, doing good and doing well.
It's about achieving market returns while also finding projects that can genuinely solve social issues. After looking into various projects, I realized that if a project can make a lot of money and also address many social and environmental problems, why hasn't anyone else invested in it yet? There must be a reason, right? For example, if it can yield around 15% returns and also do a lot of good. So why isn't anyone investing in this project? The projects we invest in, the places with no investment, risks are high. So you have to give up some things. Unless everyone, balancing both is not impossible, but finding such projects is really hard.
You just mentioned a term called gentrification. Can you explain it a bit to everyone? I remember the Chinese translation should be shensho, and its meaning refers to certain areas that were originally impoverished, with poor conditions in various aspects. And at the same time, the prices of various goods are also very cheap. For example, in the area we mentioned earlier, where we invest in real estate, it used to be a low-income area. People living here, for instance, had very cheap rent, like 200 yuan a month. However, the public security was poor, and the overall environment was not good. Then, external investments came in, such as government funds and private investors, which redeveloped the area well. Naturally, this improved the infrastructure as well. However, it led to situations like our plan to build a high-end apartment building. And with the entry of these higher-income people, the prices in the surrounding area, the prices have risen. So, for example, the 200 yuan rent that people could afford before is now unaffordable for them. They must move to farther places, or to other areas with worse conditions to find a place to live. So this means that although you have indeed developed this area quite well, you have pushed the local residents to even farther places. This is gentrification.
You just mentioned settlement. You said you spent very little time settling the people from the original area. What do you mean by settlement?
For example, of course, our project does consider providing basic settlement for these people. For instance, if there were originally 1,000 people living in this area, we would need to collaborate with the local government to build them new houses, perhaps in a further location, and then have them all move there. This is the most basic requirement. That's it. We have met the basic requirements, but the key issue is that in this situation, some people do not want to move. So, while we have provided basic settlement, some locals do not want to move. They do not want to go to that new, further location. They just want to stay here. So at this time, how do we address issues like employment and housing? We didn't really do much about it at that time. If you need to move, then you move. Otherwise, we won't tell you how to find a job here or anything like that.
Look, what does this mean? For example, he originally lived in an apartment building, right? And then you bought that apartment building, whether you demolish and rebuild it or do a major renovation, right? Does the so-called arrangement mean hoping that he still has a place to live within the original lease?
In another place, a new, cheaper building has been built, further away, and they can move there. But the people originally lived here, and sometimes they don't want to move. Plus, it's so far away. Why should I move to such a distant place? I don't want to move. If someone originally lived in Beijing, you're sending them to Hebei, Sai. Yes, I realize you haven't connected with yourself since you were a child. Let's invite Mandy to introduce herself. Sure. Hello everyone, I'm Mandy. I'm really happy to meet you all. I'm from Beijing, and I went to middle school and university in the United States. After that, I returned to Asia to work in investment banking for a few years, and then I entered the field of impact investing. Now, I've been working in impact investing in China for a few years, and then I came back to the US to pursue something. After that, I actually joined an impact investing fund here in the US. And during this process, I also started doing coaching as a side job in business school. Yes, and been here ever since. Last year, I just moved to Switzerland with my husband.
Okay, right. This is our episode. This is the second Harvard Business School alumnus for this program. And from left the United States to go to Europe.
The last place you went was Portugal. I feel like when you came here, during your high school study abroad, this story is quite interesting. Can you share a bit? Sure, sir. At that time, it was actually a very, very coincidental thing. I didn't really plan to go abroad. I was just someone who always followed the rules and did things step by step. I was the kind of kid who studied hard, the type who always followed the rules. For example, when it came to exams, like before when a classmate asked the teacher a question and the teacher said, "Oh, that's not on the exam, so don't ask it." I thought, yeah, don't waste our time with questions that aren't on the exam. So I was that kind of kid from a young age, never the one to take any unconventional paths, not at all. Then it was just a matter of chance that our school, at that time, there was actually an American foundation that was recruiting exchange students to study in the U.S. They put up a notice behind our blackboard saying they were looking for students. I thought, hey, this sounds fun. So I decided to give it a try, especially since I heard that studying in America was pretty easy. And it seemed pretty fun, so I thought, I'll just apply for it. So I went ahead and applied. After I submitted my application, I realized that I was just an average kid at our school, and there were a lot of other students who were really good academically and also wanted to go. Then later, the school said, well, those students with great grades were still focused on the college entrance exam, saying things like, if you go out,
and have fun for a year. It'll affect your exam scores. At that time, it was during my first and second year of high school when I was going abroad for a year. Then the school said, well, your grades are just average, so go ahead. Staying here for the exam, you might not even get into Tsinghua or Peking University, so just go.
That's how I ended up going, kind of without really thinking it through.
Just like the eldest son in the family, you have to follow the plan. Right. It's all about bringing honor to the family. But for the younger kids, it doesn't matter. The third child can just do whatever they want.
Right, that's exactly it. At our school, I was just an average student, and the school said, well, keeping you here isn't really useful, so just go ahead. Okay, because I remember you came to our exchange program. Right? Yes, that's right. At that time, I went to this little rural school. It was a Christian boarding school, and there were only about 300 students in the whole school. It was a really, really small place.
Ah, did you have to pay any fees? At that time, no, just this. Oh, the American benefactor, right, that foundation, they covered all the expenses. You see, this connects back, right? The foundation was completing its mission. And they also partnered with a certain prestigious high school in Beijing, not some fourth-tier city or a poor county in China. He was the same way. He arrived at the international airport in Beijing, then spent half an hour looking for a school, advertising.
Sticking? Yes, that's what they say. It's the same, really. So, of course, I can't just sell myself short, right? Because I feel like I got a good deal. Yeah, I think that's what it means. It's like when they come to China, they're still looking for these kids, and overall, the resources are pretty good for these kids in these places, right? Of course, from my personal perspective, that experience had a huge impact on me. It really changed my whole world. If it weren't for this foundation spending money to let me go abroad for this experience, my life trajectory would have been completely different. So this really influenced my later desire to pursue impact investing because my own life was changed by the kindness of others. Through this kind of philanthropy.
But of course, I am not the one who lacks the most. He is who he is, and I am not the person with the least resources. So it's somewhat true. But from my personal perspective, it has still changed. Yes, the torch has been passed down. Yes, that's what they say. Right, okay, could you talk a bit about your boarding life in rural Georgia? Could you tell me a bit about it, and if the audience in the comments acts positively, we can continue. Yes, I think when I first arrived, I originally thought my English was quite good. I don't know if everyone felt this way when they first came to the US, but I used to think I did well in English exams in China. However, once I got here, I felt like I couldn't understand anything at school. Yes, and suddenly entering that kind of high school life in America made me feel like, oh, I thought that people would be very curious about me as a Chinese person, but then I found out, it seems that's not the case. But after the initial adjustment process for listening, I found that, oh, life in America is actually quite good. First of all, the schoolwork is much easier, and most of the time is spent on things like sports, which makes me feel very happy. And at that time, I also got to experience, for example, this culture is very different. For example, in the South, people are very down-to-earth and particularly warm-hearted. I really feel that, for instance, a lot of media often talk about things like the South and its stereotypes, but I think there is some demonization involved, to be honest. When you actually interact with real people, I found that the locals were really, how should I put it? They were very kind to me. And it's not like what is often demonized nowadays, saying things like, there's xenophobia and so on. None of that exists. I actually feel that from a human-to-human perspective, those things aren't there. Right, so those years of living also had a lot of initial discomfort, but gradually I felt I actually quite liked this environment.
Culture.